Imagine it is 1787. The American experiment is not a glorious success story yet, it is a mess. The United States is operating under the Articles of Confederation, a system so weak it feels more like a loose suggestion than a government. There is no central authority to collect taxes, no unified way to raise an army, and no way to settle the constant bitter disputes between the states. To the authors of what we now call the Federalist Papers, the country isn't just struggling, it is suffering from a malady. It is a lifeless mass of competing interests, drifting toward inevitable collapse. This is the high-stakes environment that gave birth to the Federalist Papers. They weren't written as a dry textbook for future historians, but as a series of urgent, persuasive essays designed to win a very real political fight. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay took on the collective persona of Publius. Through this pseudonym, they launched a massive public argument to convince the people of New York, and eventually the whole country, to abandon the failing articles and ratify the new Constitution. The plot of the Federalist Papers is essentially a grand intellectual battle against the fear of chaos. The authors start by framing the situation as a binary choice. There is no middle ground. You either adopt this new Constitution and form a unified nation, or you reject it and watch the states splinter into small, warring confederacies. They argue that if the states remain independent, they will eventually turn on each other over territory, trade, and borders. They predict a future of constant friction, where small, localized governments become tyrannical, and the entire continent becomes a playground for European empires to exploit. To counter this, the authors have to solve a massive problem. How do you create a government that is strong enough to actually rule, but not so strong that it becomes a monarchy? One of the most important shifts in the argument comes from James Madison, who tackles the biggest fear of the era, the fear of faction. In the 1780s, many people believed that a republic could only work in a small territory where everyone knew each other. The logic was that, in a small area, a single interest group, a faction, could easily take control and oppress everyone else. Madison turns this on its head. He argues that a large, sprawling republic is actually much safer. His reasoning is brilliant in its pragmatism. In a vast territory with a huge, diverse population, there are so many different interests, religions, and economic groups that it becomes nearly impossible for a single majority to form and coordinate an attack on the rights of others. By making the country larger, you actually make it harder for any one group to seize total control. Diversity, in Madison's view, is a safeguard for liberty. As the essays move from the big picture to the actual mechanics of the government, Alexander Hamilton takes center stage to defend the idea of energy. This is a controversial word in the context of a new democracy. To many, a strong government sounded like a recipe for tyranny. But Hamilton argues that a government without energy is a government that cannot function. He points to the current chaos, the inability to pay debts or defend the borders, as proof that a weak executive is a death sentence. Hamilton's solution to the fear of a tyrant is one of the most famous concepts in political science, the idea that ambition must be used to counteract ambition. He doesn't assume that politicians will be saints. He doesn't believe that we can rely on virtue alone to keep leaders in check. Instead, he argues that we should design a system where the leader's own self-interest keeps them from overstepping. If the president wants more power, the legislature will fight him to protect its own power. If the legislature tries to pass an unjust law, the judiciary can step in to stop it. It is a system built on the assumption that humans are naturally ambitious, so we should use that ambition to create a series of checks and balances that keep everyone in their proper place. This leads into the defense of the three branches of government. The authors spend a great deal of time addressing the specific roles of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The legislature is presented as the most powerful and most dangerous branch because it is closest to the people and most susceptible to their sudden, passionate whims. This is why the authors advocate for a structure, like the two-house system of the House and Senate, that slows down the process and forces deliberation. The executive, or the presidency, is defended as a necessity for decisive action. Hamilton argues that a single person is much more accountable than a committee. If a council of many people makes a mistake, they can all point fingers at each other. If a single president makes a mistake, the people know exactly who to hold responsible. Then there is the judiciary. This is often the most misunderstood part of the Constitution, but the Federalist Papers are very clear about its purpose. The authors describe the judiciary as the least dangerous branch because it doesn't have the power of the sword or the power of the purse. However, they insist that for the Constitution to mean anything, the courts must be independent. They argue for life tenure for judges, not to make them an elite class of rulers, but to protect them from the political pressures of the other branches. The judiciary is meant to be the final safeguard, ensuring that the supreme law of the land isn't tossed aside by the temporary moods of the legislature. As the papers reach their conclusion, the tone shifts from intense debate to a plea for pragmatism. The authors realize that they aren't arguing for a perfect system. They know that any government created by humans will have flaws. They know that the debates over the Bill of Rights are important, but they argue that the Constitution itself already limits the government by only giving it specific enumerated powers. They believe that trying to list every single right a person has is a dangerous game, because you might accidentally leave something out, or you might give the government an excuse to claim powers that weren't explicitly listed. The final message of the Federalist Papers is essentially a call for stability over perfection. Hamilton and his colleagues argue that the alternative to this imperfect functional framework is not a perfect government, but total anarchy. They urge the people to accept a system that is good enough to maintain order and protect liberty, rather than risking everything by waiting for a perfect document that might never exist. When we look back at the Federalist Papers today, we can see how they shaped the very DNA of the American political system. They didn't just argue for a set of rules, they argued for a specific way of looking at human nature. They moved the conversation away from the idea that we need good men to lead us, and toward the idea that we need good structures to manage even the most ambitious of men. The core tension they identified remains the central struggle of American politics, the balance between energy and stability, between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority, and between the need for a strong central authority and the desire for local control. They recognized that a large republic is a difficult thing to manage, but they believed it was the only way to prevent the country from fracturing into 1,000 competing pieces. In the end, the Federalist Papers are a testament to the power of political philosophy to shape reality. They were written to win a specific argument in a specific moment, but they ended up providing the blueprint for a nation. They tell us that a stable government isn't one that is perfectly aligned with our ideals, but one that is designed to survive our own human flaws. It is a pragmatic, somewhat cynical, but ultimately deeply hopeful vision of how a diverse and sprawling people can live together under one roof without tearing each other apart.